So welcome again, everybody. I'm going to start the session now. Oops, there's somebody. Is there no? OK. Une autre message de Marjolaine. Merci beaucoup. So starting our session now, welcome to this this webinar. And just a few preliminary instructions. You can do the audio through your computer, or you can use a phone line. Either way works. Actually, wait a second. I'm not sure if the phone line works. If somebody's trying to use it and it does not operate, please send me a message. Right now, all of the voice lines are muted to reduce interference. But you can raise your hand on your little control panel to request the opportunity to speak, or you can send a written message in the question box. And you can do that at any time. Yes, in answer to the previous question, the presentation will be on our website as a full recording. Now, as far as the questions are concerned as we go along, I've discussed this with Craig, and he would prefer that to hold questions until the end, and then we have a full conversation with all of the input that he has suggested. However, if your question has to do with a point of clarification, I'll interrupt him and have him clarify at that point. Okay, so send in your questions at any time, and if it's something that needs immediate addressing, I'll let him know. Otherwise, he'll be taking your questions and engaging in conversation at the end. So a little bit about us. The Ethics Practitioners Organization of Canada it promotes ethical practices in organization and supports ethics practitioners across Canada. We think of practitioners as people who have official positions in organizations, in ethics and values offices, or dealing with conflict of interest or other sorts of ethical issues. But there are also people who have just more general interests in organizations. I know that some people online are also involved with research ethics. So that's a more specialized area, but research ethics happens within organizations, and organizational ethics overlaps with that. And we provide networking and educational opportunities such as this webinar. And this is in aid of pursuing our vision of a world where people in organizations are ethically aware and act ethically. So please visit our website and consider becoming a member if you're not already a member. Our presenter today is Craig Irvin. Craig has been a director of EPAC for 1.5 years. He got attracted to EPAC by its description that he found on our website, and offered to join and to take a leadership position. And we were very happy to accept him onto the board of directors. His academic background is in law. He has a master's degree in law, a master's degree in philosophy, and a doctorate in applied health studies, and has worked in various areas that apply those different types of knowledge. Right now, he's working with Canada Post on services to business in a wide geographical area, so understanding smaller businesses and businesses in rural areas, as well as the more urban concentrations. He's been an independent consultant, and he now deals with governance and training within the credit union movement, where I understand he's also active on boards of directors. So now over to you, Craig. I will make you the presenter, and off to you to advance the slides as you speak, and I'll then mute myself. Let me know when you have control, Craig.
Okay, I should have control now. As long as my voice is being heard, can everybody hear me clearly?
We can hear you clearly in this office, and unless somebody says something to the contrary, I'll assume that everybody else can hear you too. So just continue.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for your interest in this topic. The screen here shows an overview of the topic areas that we'll be covering in our discussion over the next hour or so. And I came across the phrase "opening respectful doors," the title of this webinar, while watching Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, his episode on Oman. And during the episode, he spoke with a retired Royal Marine and author by the name of Ian Gardner, who fought in the Dhofar Rebellion, also known as the Omani Civil War, which was underway around the same time as the Vietnam War. But one of the things that Bourdain noted was that the aftermath of the Dhofar Rebellion was a very different experience compared to the Vietnam situation. And Gardner explained that during and after the insurgency, the Omani leadership undertook civil aid projects to rebuild and sustain the communities that were being affected, and in so doing kind of signaled due consideration and respect towards both those who supported and those who did not support their position. So oftentimes the expected typical response would be to exclude or punish those who oppose, but the Omani leaders chose instead to open respectful doors and establish trust by including everyone in the renewal and rebuilding effort. So I think this is a good place to begin our look at civility in difficult conversations, and especially considering we are in the midst of what appears to be an unprecedented decline in trust. So to that point, we'll take a look here at the Edelman Trust Barometer. These are 2017 results, and the barometer reports on global trust and credibility issues based on survey data responses across 28 countries. So here we see that essentially trust in all four institutions, business, government, non-government organizations, and media to do what is right has declined broadly in 2017. And this is a phenomenon that has not been recorded since Edelman began tracking trust. So it's a pretty dire state of affairs. And along with this, a 2017 Pew Research Center US survey showed that the overall trust in government remains near historic lows. Surveys in Canada also show that Canadians report a decline of trust in government, and the erosion is clearly evident in other arenas as well where trust is lost. Civility and ethical conduct are similarly diminished. We see this, of course, in recent examples of fraud and scandal. Wells Fargo comes to mind, the Weinstein Company, Fox News, Volkswagen, Turing Pharmaceuticals, the list goes on and on. But that significant decline in trust over the past year may be attributed to some of the ongoing discovery and reports of corporate scandals, bad behavior of those in positions of power, and social climate in which derisive and caustic communications are tolerated and encouraged. Typically inflammatory, disparaging, and coarse language act to deteriorate trust and respect and civility, and yet more and more it seems to be both accepted and emboldened. So I think if we agree with Robert Nozick's observation that our fundamental connection to the world is not explanatory but one of relation and trust, then this is a very troubling state of affairs. So I think it's interesting to note that in 1996, about 5 years prior to the scandal that would expose Enron, which is, at the time one of the world's largest companies, I think it was the 6th largest in the world, when that massive financial fraud was exposed, or just prior to that actually, they won a corporate conscience award from the Council of Economic Priorities, which honored companies, and I quote, that exemplify a commitment to corporate social responsibility through responsiveness to employees, equal opportunity employment, community involvement, environmental stewardship, and international human rights. Quite a list. So Enron at the time was clearly viewed as a trusted and exemplary organization. And a more recent example, maybe along those same lines, certainly an example of eroded trust due to unethical conduct, is the case of Volkswagen. So here we have the case of a very large company that has enjoyed incredible brand loyalty from its customers for many, many years. Volkswagen is behind only Audi, Mercedes, and Alfa Romeo when it comes to loyalty from its customer base. And some of that can be is due in part or can be attributed to the iconic Beetle brand, which has been and remains the best-selling car in automotive history. And of course, the Herbie the Love Bug films, which helped to solidify brand awareness and kind of celebrate that vehicle, helped elevate that status as well. But about 2 years ago, their customer allegiance took a bit of a hit. So in September 2015, reports that Volkswagen had intentionally programmed certain diesel engines, and those were in the model years 2009 to 2015, affected 11 million vehicles, in such a way that they would pass emissions testing that they would not otherwise pass, created quite a scandal and precipitated investigations in multiple jurisdictions. So Volkswagen shares lost 30% of their value in the days after that software was reported. And then in the US, sales for November 2015 were nearly 25% less than the prior year sales. So that would be November 2014. And the positive affect towards the brand disappeared virtually overnight, fulfilling Benjamin Franklin's observation that it takes many good deeds to build a good reputation and only one bad one to lose it. So the cost of the scandal was an astounding $23.9 billion, according to a report by Bloomberg earlier this year. And it seems that the commitment to ethics was more one of ornamentation rather than implementation. They certainly had an ethics program and ethics training, but clearly, for whatever reason, that training was not followed through or implemented to the extent that this could have been avoided. So, there are many kind of more insidious and difficult to quantify costs to consider when trust declines and is lost. And John Plender, writing in a 2012 collection of essays called Trust and Ethics in Finance, refers to the American economist Francis Fukuyama's view that a lack of trust imposes a kind of tax on all forms of economic activity. So he explains that bad behavior erodes trust and forces people to place heavier reliance on the law and regulation. And the more transactions have to be governed by contract, the more cumbersome and expensive business and finance become. So a similar observation was made by philosopher Richard Rorty in 1999 in an essay called Ethics Without Principles. And he talks about that the fact that morality and law begin when controversy arises. We invent both when we can no longer do what comes naturally, when routine is no longer good enough or when habit and custom no longer suffice. So the alternative to trust is increased regulation and related external controls, which are both administratively daunting and very, very costly. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are many carefully crafted ethics codes and compliance regulations. Most organizations have them. But having an ethics code established and available within a corporate or a government enterprise doesn't necessarily shape or direct behavior. Some of the examples that I gave show. Trust and civility are essential for forging and sustaining relationships and social networks based on mutual respect and regard. So, as John Tate points out in his 1996 publication, A Strong Foundation Report of the Task Force on Public Service Values and Ethics, codes and rules have their place. They are even essential at certain times and for certain purposes, but they are not enough. They work when they capture what is already the strong conviction and broad practice of a community. So the idea of practice is often abstracted to an edict, which is somehow supposed to govern or regulate behavior. But often it's more colloquially identified as a talk not walked. And as Andrew Stark pointed out nearly 25 years ago, any business ethics worthy of the name should be an ethics of practice. Both Stark and Tate are expressing the idea that ethics must be embodied and lived and applied. And this is captured here in this slide by a quote from researchers Nicholas Berbeles and Paul Smyers, who talk about that, what it means to conceive of an ethics of practice. It's an activity, it's constellation of learned activities and skills. It's something that is shared. It's something that, takes trial and error. And this is how we learn how to kind of navigate those both expected and unexpected situations. So I think that this brings to mind an example that I'll share with you. So last year, as part of my continuing legal education, I took a course through Osgoode Hall Law School on ethics and administrative justice. And during one of the panel discussions, a question was asked about how a chairperson can set the ethical tone when chairing a tribunal or leading an investigation. And the response from the panelists was that it was vitally important to conduct the work with integrity and fairness, modeling appropriate behaviors, having vigilance concerning impartiality, transparency, and communications. And the view of the panelists was that ethics needed to be embodied through appropriate contact and bearing. It's part of it is about your manner, about your demeanor. And this sense of grounding ethics through conduct is something that was a central feature of philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's perspective on ethics. And if we follow Wittgenstein's thinking and agree that ethics talk pushes against the limits of language, it can nonetheless be applied and displayed through behaviors, actions, and lifestyles, which in their own way testify to this fundamental characteristic of life. So ethics and trust and civility are all interrelated, and the way in which we conduct ourselves and communicate with one another is important for developing and maintaining the interpersonal consideration and respect, upon which our own fidelity to ethics depends. So in many ways, before we can talk about ethics, we really have to talk about how we talk. So there are times when you're involved in a difficult dialogue, and as challenging and as uncomfortable as those can be, it's an opportunity to understand the other person and be understood by them. So if rapport and trust can be established, a relationship based on mutual regard and ethical conduct is much more likely and sustainable than in cases where there is no trust. So if we think about dialogue and the importance of dialogue in operating within an ethical kind of sphere, dialogue is intrinsically a process of sharing thoughts, feelings, ideas, related information, and it's through that process that we come to understand not only ourselves, but our relationships with others. And noted kind of author and researcher on dialogue, William Isaacs, he comments that human beings create, refine, and share knowledge through conversation. So implicit in any communicative relational undertaking is a matter of trust. The dialogue process is an opening up of vulnerability and discovery, and as such, it reveals more than just a point of view. It informs who we are and how we conduct ourselves. And again, going back to John Tate and his view on dialogue, he states, and I quote, "Dialogue implies two things. First, exchange, discussion, debate, the acknowledgement that there are or can be more than one perspective on important issues, and that each of these may have something to contribute to a deeper or fuller understanding of reality. The second thing dialogue implies is that truth or the whole truth is not known at the outset. It only emerges from the dialogue itself. Thus, a dialogue requires openness, patience, an ability to listen and to absorb, a capacity to resist the rush of judgment, and a willing suspension of belief." And similarly, William Isaacs explains that dialogue is a conversation with a center, not sides. It's a way of taking the energy of our differences and channeling it towards something that has never been created before. So there are times and in certain settings, it may be useful to create and use a set of ground rules to keep a dialogue focused and efficient. So even in cases where people share similar backgrounds, allegiances, and interests, difficult conversations can be thorny. So take, for example, boardroom discussions. They can be very animated, very impassioned, and this is true even when the people around the table are all there to serve, maybe to save a shared purpose. So I like this, I find this kind of a provocative quote. So this is from the International Finance Corporation, and they note that a board that never argues or disagrees is most likely inactive, passive, or inattentive. In other words, an ineffective board that is neither fulfilling its oversight function nor carrying out its duty of care. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily the case that a board that never argues is necessarily ineffective, but I think there is bound to be disagreements over some issues, and that the way in which these are handled is extremely important for both the current and future interactions. So difficult conversations are analogous to stormy waters. They can be unsettling, unpredictable, sometimes unavoidable, and often very necessary to adapt to. So put another way, and quoting Franklin Roosevelt, a smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. So a 2013 global survey of 191 board members undertaken by the Center for Effective Dispute Resolution and the International Finance Corporation found that 30% reported having experienced a boardroom dispute affecting the survival of their organization. And 43% reported that conflict reduced the level of trust amongst the board members. So there's a good deal of solid research evidence, and much of this is echoed by professional practitioners, advising that a reasonable first step to help difficult conversations proceed in a positive way is to create a meeting charter or a code. So the meeting charter describes the meeting process. So those behavioral norms and expectations that everyone at the meeting agrees to observe and adhere to. And the point is not to be mired in strict rules, but to develop meeting practices that encourage civil dialogue and interactions with a view towards ensuring that everyone is comfortable engaging in the conversation. The idea is to seek balance between too formal or too prescriptive and too informal and too unstructured. So I think that the code, in order to be fully accepted, it needs to be developed collaboratively. It needs to be regularly applied and reviewed. And I think that how it will look or what shape it'll take will really depends on the needs of the group. So it might have some procedural aspects. Most of the time they do. That would include, specifying start and end times and, rules around technology use in the room, those kinds of things. It probably will have some behavioral aspects. So, advice not to interrupt others when they're speaking, that there be one speaker at a time, those kinds of things. Possibly it could be some conceptual ideas as well, that people are engaged, that they bring a creative spirit to the meeting, and one or all of these aspects can change over time, but the primary function is to establish and maintain a space for mutual regard, civil discourse, and debate. So I often find it useful to look at the origin of words to shed some additional light on their meaning. So if we look at the meaning of the word meeting, it actually comes from the Old English, describing the action of coming together. Also denotes, gathering of people for discussion. And convene derives from Middle French and Latin, and indicates the idea of uniting, of agreeing, of assembling. And we see that based on these early meanings of both terms, that civility is involved in the very act of assembling together. So civility, it refers to the behavioral and social standards that we observe and maintain for interacting with one another. And it's useful to keep in mind the following point put forward again by the aforementioned International Finance Corporation, where they explain that a civil environment does not preclude animated debate, deeply held beliefs, emotional speech and action, or passionate convictions. A lack of civility can too easily trigger antipathy and anger, thus inhibiting free discussion and debate. And I think that if we consider that for a moment, and also in light of something similar that Mark Kingwall points out, civility is also about openness and commitment to risk, and to preserve, to create something bigger. It means putting your own beliefs at risk, and I think that is maybe one of the most difficult challenges to think about and to ruminate on. So I think that it's important that an initial strategy in dealing with difficult conversations is to have a process in place. Establish meaningful, collaboratively developed board, committee, ground rules, review them regularly, update and refine them, as often as needed. It's been my experience that regardless of meeting or topic or agenda, it's always beneficial to begin the conversation with an agreeable comment or observation to establish that sense of rapport. And while I was in the graduate law program at Osgoode Hall, one of my colleagues was a very experienced mediator, negotiator, and he firmly believed that setting or signaling the right tone at the beginning of the meeting was vital to having a productive and successful session. And when you think about that, when you think about setting that tone, about signaling the kind of communication that's going to take place, you think about the fact that communication is really the foundational kind of way of dealing with conflict and difficult conversations. So one of the things that researchers Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen point out is that the two hardest and most important communication tasks in difficult conversations are expressing feelings and listening. And I think that in order to really provide the opportunity for feelings to be expressed, it's important to consider something that they call the learning conversation. So this is a dialogue in which people share information. That information includes feelings and values. They ask questions. They actively try to understand the situation from the other person's perspective. And it's really that idea around discovering. It's about curiosity. It's about kind of interaction and sharing. And there's kind of an interesting example which I'll share with you. And I came across it through a writer, Charles Duhigg, and he was talking about Lorne Michaels. So Lorne Michaels is a longtime producer of Saturday Night Live, and because the show is taped weekly, or actually is I should say taped live weekly, he has weekly production meetings. So the point of the meetings, of course, is to ensure that that everybody's on the same page and has an understanding of what's about to happen. So it's really important that everyone at the table contributes to the discussion. And if someone hasn't spoken up or contributed, Michaels will pause and he'll say, "Listen, I notice you haven't commented yet. What are you thinking about right now?" And he elicits that response. He's trying to make sure that people are involved and engaged. And if someone appears to be having a bad day, he'll stop the meeting and he'll address that by inquiring about their mood and encouraging them to talk about what's bothering them. And he expresses both interest and concern, and through that dialogue establishes and oftentimes reinforces the team trust bond. So clearly this way of conducting a meeting could take more time, but Lorne Michaels and his team are known for being productive and meeting very, very tight time schedules. And I think that what can be seen here is that through his meeting style, he's able to bring the writers and the actors and the production crew together in a space where they feel safe sharing and contributing in a way that meets their needs, but also ensures that great program ideas are generated and and implemented at that week's end. So it's really about finding a way to allow issues to surface, especially those that are troubling, and to avoid misunderstanding and or miscommunication kind of early on in the process. So I think it's a wonderful strategy. I think it's one that can be applied in not only professional lives but in private lives as well. And again, referencing the International Finance Corporation report, there's another kind of extract there, and where it says one of the biggest communication mistakes on boards and in general is to assume that we know how others receive what we are trying to communicate. People exposed to the same information can end up with completely different impressions and ideas. So I think that by encouraging participation and using open-ended questions, so questions along the lines of what are your thoughts on, or I'm not sure I fully understand your point, can you provide more details, some of the miscommunication or misinterpretation issues can be avoided. So inquiring about someone else's perspective really signals respect for their view, and it shows that you value their thoughts, and oftentimes this will create momentum towards resolving differences. So author and mediator Bernard Mayer, he points out that communication needs to be interactive and effective. And I think that, again, Stone, Patton, and Heen note that listening well really is one of the most powerful skills you can bring to a difficult conversation. So in a sense, effective communication should provide solid ROI. And in this case, ROI is not return on investment, but return on involvement. So return on involvement is the value derived by having everyone at the table share views, ask questions, and probe alternatives. And through that involvement, meetings and decisions undertaken will have a more robust and collaborative quality. And I think that listening signals a genuine interest in the other person's perspective, and through careful listening, areas of common ground and shared positions are more readily revealed, and this allows progress to be made throughout that interaction. William Isaacs, he comments that dialogues often have a quality of shared emergence, where in speaking together, people realize that they have been thinking about the same things. David Bohm, one of the most important physicists of the 20th century and author of a book called On Dialogue, explains that close listening involves sensitivity. It's about being alert to and watching subtle cues, body language, facial expressions, tonality, inflection, those kinds of things, in order to respond effectively in a way that reaches the whole issue, allows those underlying issues to surface. So I have an example of strong communication that's really stuck with me for a number of years, well over 20 years since I first encountered it, and it's something from the life of Jesse Owens. So Jesse Owens, after his legendary athletic career, was involved in a number of national and international humanitarian organizations. And for 2 decades, he served as a director of the Illinois Youth Commission, where he worked with disadvantaged youth. And he would, on occasion, be called to the police station. And if one of the young people in his program had been detained, upon gaining their release to his custody, he would take them for a walk. And he would urge them to express themselves, to communicate. And he would say, the more we talk, the more we walk, the more we're going to understand one another. And I like that kind of way of sharing or signaling that there's great value in communication and in coming to a shared understanding. And it kind of echoes psychiatrist and author Carl Goldberg's perspective. He says that far more concern needs to be given to how we speak with one another in our everyday interactions. He notes that our humanity is forged by our words as well as our actions, and that when we express ourselves freely and articulately, we can reach others and sensitize them to our true sentiments and desires. So, some ideas to kind of increase interactive communication, would include tracking the number of questions asked or the number of ideas generated in a meeting or in a conference setting or what have you. This will help to determine if there's a learning conversation culture. And if not, then, we can certainly apply some of the strategies that both Lauren Michaels and Jesse Owens have used. William Isaacs, going back to him, advises, pay attention to the actions that are missing and provide them yourself, or encourage others to do so. With groups, consider a roundtable discussion to provide each person an opportunity to speak. So one way to elicit, more thoughts and ideas is to comment, I think this is an interesting issue, and I wonder what others have to contribute on the matter. That way you kind of open it up to the room and invite others to kind of join into that conversation. So, along with these discussions around conversations and dialogue, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk for a moment about emotions. So, again, going back to that 2015 International Finance Corporation report, it was noted that respondents believed or stated that dealing with emotions was the most difficult aspect of dealing with disputes. And researchers Van Cleef and Van Lang explain that conflict is inherently emotional. It's an inherently emotional event. Personal and business conflicts alike have strong potential to elicit emotions. So I think that an important first step in dealing with emotion is to really recognize and accept that emotion and emotional response are normal and defining aspects of who we are as human beings. Emotion, reveals a person's feelings on a matter. It reveals, their sense of values, their commitment to a point of view, and in some ways their social intentions. So emotions provide insights in ways that maybe words can't accurately or adequately reveal. So, both philosopher Richard Rorty and long before him, David Hume, put a lot of focus on sentiment in morality and anchoring it to morality. And, they believe that both ethics and morality have an emotional context. And in the case of Rorty, noting the ability to notice and to identify with the pain and humiliation that others are feeling or going through. I like this kind of observation from Stanford University professor Margaret Neal, where she explains that anger is an optimistic emotion. Folks don't get angry if they think there's no hope of changing the situation. They get angry because they think they can change the situation and make it better. So, we don't generally experience vividly expressed emotions in our day-to-day interactions. So it's something that when it does occur, it can be unsettling. And Stone, Patton, and Heen comment that in any given situation, our feelings follow our thoughts. Our feelings are changeable and are largely based on perception and context. And in many cases, a change in perception leads to a change in feelings. So some years ago, about a decade ago, I trained with a tactical confrontation expert in Montreal named Tony Blauer. And he would point out that, there's a difference in people's perceptions between telling them that you have a dog versus telling them that you have a Rottweiler. it's a very different response. And coincidentally, at the time, my wife and I, we owned a female Rottweiler, and she was a very kind, intelligent dog. But I often had the experience while walking her that people would cross the street, before reaching us rather than walk past us. And I'm kind of under the impression that their perception was probably due to feelings of fear, or at least apprehension of the dog, the Rottweiler, in this case the Rottweiler, and perhaps things would have been differently if we were, in this case, if I was walking a poodle, for example. So, those perceptual and emotional responses can be really difficult to manage. So it's important to inquire or to investigate where those feelings are coming from, where those perceptions might be coming from, and to work forward from that insight. So along those lines is I think it's kind of interesting to explore the word confront, which comes to us from French and Latin usages, and taking a look at it kind of reveals the etymology kind of reveals some interesting impressions. So when you look at that word confront, it can mean to stand in front of, but it can also mean standing beside. So the Latin derivation describes with and together. So confront can be interpreted to mean head to head in an opposing or an oppositional sense, or head to head in a collaborative sense. So head to head, or in this case, shoulder to shoulder. And I think that that's an interesting way to think about it. And so going from there, it's a really interesting code of confrontation that author and mediator Brian Muldoon talks about in his book called The Heart of Conflict. And so I found this very useful over the years to reference. So I think it's worth taking a look at here. So the first principle in Muldoon's code of confrontation, or code of conflict, in a sense, is respect. In any conflict circumstance, there's a lot that's going on below the surface, and typically what is revealed is only part of the picture, not the whole picture. So if we treat others with respect, even when it's difficult, we avoid that downward spiral of reaction or retribution, those kinds of things, those negative kind of reactions, which often end up deepening a disagreement or a divide. His second principle is courage. So, fear is a disabling and debilitating state, and it's a response that really limits growth. It limits creativity. Many ways it shuts down understanding. So courage really works the opposite. It creates options. Fear takes them away. So, as I noted earlier, I was trained on a couple of occasions with Tony Blauer and his team on confrontation management techniques and strategies. And Blauer developed 3 key rules for physical confrontations, which I think are really or just as useful for psychological challenges. And the 3 are: accept where you are, get challenged, and don't stop thinking. All 3 of those are about creating options, about staying open to opportunities. And where there are options, there are going to be routes to resolution. Muldoon's third principle is patience. Reacting on impulse is usually not helpful in a confrontation. A much more desirable strategy is to ask questions, encourage discussion, and give the matter and those involved in it some time. Bernard Mayer, he explains that an impasse, or in any impasse situation, slower is usually faster. So the tendency is to kind of respond to an impasse by turning on or creating more pressure, by imposing deadlines and amping up the urgency. But he finds that when people take the time to think through their choices, when they have the time to kind of revisit their concerns, come to their own conclusions, they usually become much more flexible, much more imaginative, and much more realistic. So there's a couple of strategies that are helpful when dealing with confrontation. And I think that, the first one here is about preparing for possibilities rather than problems. If you're anticipating a confrontational encounter or find yourself in one, it's really easy to view or respond to it negatively. And that, of course, limits the options for finding a way through. Instead, it's much more helpful to kind of reframe the issue as a possibility and to orient accordingly. Certainly leading with curiosity, asking those open questions, how, what, and why questions are really important. keeping yes and in play is really essential. One of the key exercises in improv acting classes is using this idea of yes and. So the idea is that regardless of what the other person says or does, you agree and respond in a way that continues the interaction. So that yes and is always about keeping the interaction going, seeing where it's going to lead to. Robert Weinberg, he's one of the world's leading oncology researchers, and a while back he was asked in an interview what attributes are most essential for his work as a cancer researcher, and he replied, curiosity and optimism. He said these are important attributes to have as in that line of work, but they're also important attributes to have in dealing with any kind of difficult conversation or difficult situation. So, going back to Stone, Patton, and Heen, they talk about curiosity as a bit of a stance. So, having a stance of curiosity creates that space for the dialogue to begin, for it to continue, and for options to emerge. It helps to ensure communication channels stay open. So there's a really subtle way of moving a confrontation to a collaboration, and going back to that root meaning of the word confront as meaning both together, or at least interpreting it more as together rather than against. Brian Muldoon explains that collaboration implies a relationship, which demands much more from us than mere agreement or surrender of dissent. Collaboration is a living, dynamic process that constantly moves forward. So when dealing with confrontation or any kind of difficult conversation, it's a good idea to begin with the smaller, less challenging issues to achieve agreement and gain momentum, and while keeping those larger issues in view. And so just to give you an example, I've been involved in a number of confrontational interactions over my career, and I have one which is particularly memorable. So one morning, a number of years ago, while I was working with the Canada Post Rural Mail Safety Team, I received a phone call from a very angry customer who demanded to know what right we had to ask him to move his mailbox. And he was yelling so loudly into the phone that I had to hold it away from my ear. And he demanded that I meet with him right away. And it was about a 10-minute drive to his home. And during the drive, my colleague, who had heard the entire call, even though he was standing at the time on the other side of the vehicle, asked what the plan was. And I responded that we're going to meet with him, and we're going to treat him like we would any other customer. And I could tell by the look on his face that he wasn't feeling terribly hopeful. So the customer was waiting for us outside when we arrived, and he had his arms crossed and quite an agitated look on his face. And as I walked towards him and introduced myself, I extended my hand and shook his and complimented his beautiful property. And he paused for a moment and replied that he'd recently landscaped the area and was quite proud of the results. And I could see in that moment that his manner softened a little bit. And he then said that he didn't understand why we were asking him to move his mailbox. And I asked him to walk with me to where his mailbox was located, which he did. And as we walked, I explained the risk posed by higher traffic volumes, concerns about adequate sight lines when the delivery person is needing to merge back onto the road after delivery. And he agreed that those were important issues. But he'd spent a good deal of time doing that landscaping around his home and around his mailbox, and he really did not want to alter the location. So I explained to him that it wasn't necessarily the only option to move his mailbox, that there were other options available. And we talked about what those options look like, and he chose the one that was very most convenient to him, which was to receive delivery in a community mailbox across the street from his home. So he could maintain his mailbox where it was, still get his his flyers and his papers and whatnot in his mailbox, but for the safety of the delivery person, they would use the community mailbox located in a parking area right directly across from him. So his anger was based on his perception that we were providing a single alternative, and one that he didn't appreciate because of the time he spent landscaping and beautifying his property. So once both he and I had the opportunity to share more information, we were able to arrive at a resolution that satisfied both our concerns. The interaction started out on a confrontational footing, but by applying Muldoon's code, leading with respect, showing courage towards adversity, and remaining patient and calm, a positive way forward was found. And again, this goes back to the importance of embodying an ethical and respectful position, which, you know, sets that tone for the interaction. So there are going to be those times when, for whatever reason, impasse is unavoidable. And the word impasse comes to us from the 18th century French term describing an impassable road, a blind alley, or a dead end. So, you know, what do you do when you're confronted with these kinds of situations? You seek an alternate route. You reorient. You know, you find a way around that obstacle. The obstacle, once it's in front of you, becomes the path forward. And there's actually a Zen maxim which along those lines states that the obstacle is the path. So it's I think important to really look at it from that reorientation point of view. And in fact, in a case where there is an impasse, you have no other alternative but to seek that reorientation. So Stone, Patton, and Heen advise that you know, wherever you want to go, understanding, imagine yourself in the other person's story has to be the first step. Before you can figure out how to move forward, you need to understand where you are. And I think that dealing with impasse is about being able to adapt to and to keep your mind open to possibilities. So you know, this idea, this way of thinking aligns with Tony Blauer's primary rule when you find yourself in a difficult, unpredictable, or dangerous situation, which is accept where you are. If you do not accept your current situation, you will not be able to reorient and generate options to improve or manage that situation. So Bernard Mayer, he also comments that, as with so much else about effective conflict resolution, moving through an impasse is usually more a matter of attitude than having a, you know, the appropriate tool or technique. And research undertaken by Stanford psychology professor Carol Dweck over the past 30 years shows that people generally fall into two attitude categories. They either have a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. Those whose attitude is rooted in a growth mindset embrace challenge and are able to adapt to difficult or changing circumstances, and they're able to overcome fear and really rebound from setbacks or failures. Those whose attitude is rooted in a fixed mindset don't have that much flexibility in their thinking and really resist change. The good news is that you know, a growth mindset can be encouraged and developed. And you know, incidentally, up until the mid-1960s, scientists believed that from the onset of adulthood, the brain itself was in a changeless, static state. But research undertaken by Marion Diamond and her colleagues at the University of Berkeley showed that the human brain, you know, had the ability to change and develop at any age, that it had what's called plasticity. So there's some good kind of research and practice-based strategies that can be used to overcome impasse. And I think that it's worth taking a look at a few of these. Referencing a mutually agreeable objective standard or criterion to resolve an issue is often quite helpful. So this comes to us from Roger Fisher and William Urey's seminal work, Getting to Yes, which was published back in 1981. And the idea is that by introducing independently determined fact or evidence to a dispute, any issues that have been challenged on subjective or self-interested grounds can be measured against and agreed upon according to, you know, a more objective standard. I think that's very helpful. Going back to Bernard Mayer again, you know, avoiding deadlines, ultimatums, or intimidation tactics, very essential to overcoming impasse. As he points out, anxiety and fear are not helpful. Anxiety and fear breed rigidity and shut down communication and creativity. So, you know, therefore, it's really important to avoid the temptation to try to move past impasse by increasing fear and anxiety. And Brian Muldoon, he recommends identifying and linking to a destination. You know, having a goal or a purpose in view. You know, he notes that it's a very powerful organizing principle that people, when presented with a destination or a target, tend to move towards it. And I think that's something that's worth keeping in mind. Oftentimes, you know, you get involved in an impasse and you have a sense of the hopelessness of being involved in it, and you lose sight of the goal, of the purpose of, you know, of being there in the first place. So back in 1910, philosopher and educator John Dewey said something, you know, similar. He described that organizing role of having an end in view, noting that a question to be answered and ambiguity to be resolved sets up an end and holds the current of ideas to a definite channel. So having that goal or that purpose in mind, or identifying it at strategic points along the way, can be really, really helpful. I think that it's also important that when a conversation is increasing confusion, when it's increasing misunderstanding or frustration, and starting to lock people into those positional or defensive communications, you really need to introduce or think about ways to think about the issue differently. And there's a number of different kind of strategies around this, and usually they fall under the heading of redescription. And so redescription is concerned with describing issues in a new or different way and reworking the problem from a fresh explorative perspective. Professor Gideon Calder from Wales, he explains that redescription is a matter of imaginatively making new descriptions hang together with existing ones. It's about recontextualization, reinterpretation, reimagining of given attitudes and ways of looking at problems. So the way that redescription, or the form that it often takes, is that of a generative metaphor, presenting an existing concept or problem in a different, more expansive form. So a generative metaphor is describing something as like something else, but in a way that generates a different sense of the thing described. So, a couple of quick and very, simple examples. Something along the lines of, this problem is like a patient with an illness and we need to find a way to diagnose it. Or, what if we looked at this issue from the base of the building rather than the top floor? So it's kind of trying to describe things in a way that changes the way that, we are currently looking at it, which is proving to be unhelpful. So metaphor finds its origins, or the word metaphor finds its origins in Latin and Greek, and means to transfer, carry over, alter, or change. And both redescription and generative metaphors are concerned with deploying creative ways of thinking in order to solve a problem or overcome impasse. So Frank Barrett and David Cooperrider put it this way: generative metaphor then is an invitation to see anew, to facilitate the learning of new knowledge, to create new scenarios of future action, and to overcome areas of rigidity. So, this idea of generative metaphor is it's an exercise in both kind of speaking and listening, being open, being alert and responsive in a way that generates new perspectives or generates different ways of seeing deeply rooted problems. And I think that we see that again here from Brian Muldoon, that listening is really essential, that it opens up those roots past the impasse by allowing space for change to happen. And along those same lines, Stone, Patton, and Heen note that changes in attitudes and behavior rarely come about because of arguments, facts, and attempts to persuade. People are more likely to change if they think we understand them and if they feel heard and respected. So I'll give you one more example from my rural mail safety review years. I had an encounter with a customer that hopefully illustrates this point. I received a call one afternoon, and it was a customer who wanted me to meet with him at his home, and I agreed to meet with him despite the fact that his only availability was past my normal work schedule. So he was very polite when I arrived, but generally dismissive of the safety review that we were engaged in, and he asked a number of fairly pointed questions about the assessment process, how it was developed, how it was applied, what it meant for him specifically, those kinds of things. And we spoke for well over an hour. And at the end of our conversation, he told me that his intent for the meeting was to discredit the entire process and refuse to comply. But because I listened, so patiently and closely to his concerns and provided the information that he was not previously aware of, he kind of altered his perspective and agreed to cooperate and make the adjustment that we requested. He also told me that the member of parliament for his riding was a personal friend, and after our meeting, his intention was to contact his MP and to ask him to intervene on his behalf. But because of the time spent with him that afternoon, that evening, he felt that was no longer necessary. So I think that, to the point of how listening is so important, he really felt heard and respected. And through, that kind of dialogue where, there's that give and take, but there's an awful lot of listening on my part. He came to see the merits of the safety assessment. He came to see the merits of the process. So this is a kind of a nice segue into something that some research done by Project Aristotle, which is a project undertaken by Google back in 2012. So Project Aristotle is so named, and is named in honor of a quote by Aristotle, and the quote is, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts," a very well-known quote that has a lot of kind of applications in philosophy and other areas as well. But getting back to Google, back in 2012, they initiated a study to find out why some teams were very successful and others less so, even though all the team members had, excellent credentials and experience. And what the researchers found was that, there was no particular combination of personality types or skill sets, which is what, they really had anticipated, that can predict success. What they discovered instead was that it wasn't so much who was on the team, but how the team worked together, how the team interacted. And their analytics, and nobody does analytics better or more extensively than Google, showed that successful teams were those in which the members trusted and respected one another, and shared a climate of openness. So the high-performing teams exhibited what researchers describe as psychological safety. And according to Amy Edmondson, who coined that term, she's a professor of leadership and management at Harvard Business School. She explains that psychological safety is that sense of confidence that the team will not embarrass, reject, or punish someone for speaking up. It describes a team climate characterized by interpersonal trust and mutual respect in which the people on the teams are comfortable being themselves. So Charles Duhigg, he explains that the Google data indicated that psychological safety, more than anything else, was critical to making a team work. So that psychological safety, it's characterized by open discussions on work and life issues in a supportive and tolerant context. And going back to that example of Lorne Michaels in his Saturday Night Live pre-production meetings, we see that really what he's fostering in those meetings is this sense of psychological safety. And I think that when you look at the successful teams that Google, and you look at how those worked per Google's review, that supportive context, that conversational turn taking is really important. So if you have a team where people do not fear taking risks, where they don't fear sharing their mistakes, you have a team that is able to grow and able to learn from those mistakes, able to kind of collaboratively determine whether those risks are worth taking, or whether the risks could be taken differently, those kinds of things. So Brian Welly, he's a director of people analytics at Google. He explains that the Google sales teams with the highest level of psychological safety outperform the revenue targets on average by 17%, while those with the least psychological safety underperformed on average by 19%. So, after all of that data collection and data analysis, Google arrived at a fairly unsurprising insight, that trust and the way in which people interact within a trusting environment brings out the best in people. So I think this quote from John Hallowell, who's a longtime researcher in the area of trust and respect, he says, trust in others has been repeatedly found to be a vital support for happier lives. This trust takes many forms. It ranges from, the comforting thought that friends and relatives are ready to help in times of need, to belief in the generosity of strangers willing to pick up and return a lost wallet, to belief that, the word of a colleague or business associate can be relied upon, to the broader trust in public institutions and governance. Going back to where we began with that, the Edelman Trust Barometer. But while the evidence shows that all forms of trust are important, trust in one's environment of friends, neighbors, and workmates matters most. And again, going back to that Edelman research, Ben Boyd, who's the president and CEO for Edelman Canada and Latin America, similarly notes, recognizing that the treatment and relationship with employees and customers alike is integral to building trust, business should adopt an inside-out approach, which begins with listening. No single action is more interconnected with building trust than treating employees well. So some of the other kind of traits of high-performing teams that Google uncovered or revealed is, that team members are dependable, they complete their tasks on time, that each member possessed a good understanding of job expectations, their role and the role of others, that they feel that their work is meaningful, and that work has impact. And it's interesting to kind of put this in the context of a study from a recent study undertaken by Bain & Company. And they found that when compared to satisfied employees, engaged employees are 44% more productive, while those who report being inspired by their work are 125% more productive. So that sense of meaning, that sense of impact, that sense of inspiration, that really clearly matters to people, and it really does give them that ability to bring out the best in themselves. And I think that the seeking, this is an interesting and valuable quote from Carl Goldberg. He says that the seeking of meaning is a common dimension of human experience, one that summarizes the way in which we relate to our personal world and the shared world of others. It is from an ability to use language intelligently that we acquire a facility in seeking personal meaning for ourselves in relationship with others. In other words, it is language that enables us to be human rather than brute and solitary beasts. So clearly, creating and maintaining a safe space for people to express themselves openly and without fear of reprisal or of embarrassment is essential for both trust and ethics to flourish. And I think that ending this presentation with a couple of remarks from Richard Rorty and Annette Beyer will sum it up nicely. So Richard Rorty notes here, my candidate for the most distinctive and praiseworthy human capacity is their ability to trust and cooperate with other people, and in particular to work together so as to improve the future. Annette Beyer notes that we inhabit a climate of trust as we inhabit an atmosphere, and notice it as we notice air, only when it becomes scarce or polluted. So we've made our way through a good deal of content, and I'm happy to hear any questions you have. And yeah, I'll open it up to the audience.
Thank you very much, Craig. I've unmuted my my microphone as well. So at this point, I would encourage all of you to either write in a question, or preferably just so-called raise your hand and give us your question verbally. That'll both save time and I think be a little bit more interesting to hear your articulation. While waiting for somebody to do either of those things, I'll ask you one very small technical question. In an early slide, you quoted Richard Nozick saying that we relate to the world not through explanation, but through trust. I found that intriguing. Could you just explain that a little bit?
Sure. I'll just wait. I think I'm back on here. Yeah, I think that what he's getting at is that so much of our interactions occur with that background of trust, implicitly already in our social networks, our social environments, our forms of life. So, when you think about driving down the street, you're trusting the engineers who not only built your car, but created the road system, created those intersection systems, created the rules of the road, those painted lines. There's all kinds of things that we do day to day that really, is one of relation and trust in, although maybe not explicitly, but is certainly implicit, and some of those may be explicit as well. So I think that what he's getting at is that we exist already within a web of trust, within that network of trust, and that we often forget that, and we need to really be reminded of that. So, and hopefully this webinar helped move towards that reminder state.
Okay, here's another one that occurred to me as I was listening to you. Sometimes one is really dealing with rudeness, and people who when chastised a little bit would say, well, I say what I think, and I present that as as a real virtue somehow or other. Can you comment on that? Because I think that's a rather common phenomenon.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. I have a jet either taking off or landing somewhere in the distance behind me. But yeah, I think that's a very common kind of circumstance. And there's been some good research just on that topic by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Robert Sutton. He's a professor of management science at Stanford. And he explains that that both bad behavior and incivility, they're very contagious. So it's really important to limit it as much as possible. And people who display poor or disruptive behavior, often what they're seeking is a response that keeps that negative interaction going on. So they kind of feed from that negativity. So he advises staying calm and composed, something that we talked about when dealing with impasse earlier in the webinar, and really slowing down your response time so that you don't give them anything to work with. You kind of put out that fire, throw some water on that fire. And he says that it may also be useful to respond to them by simply reframing their outburst and putting a more positive spin on it, or putting it, if you happen to be in a room, a meeting room or a boardroom or what have you, or with a group of people, maybe putting the comment to the group for review. And saying something along the lines of, I see you're upset by this situation. Are there others who share this feeling? So again, distributing that negativity or redistributing it in a way that you might be able to move it towards a more positive interaction. So doing these kinds of things will allow those situations to be diffused in a sense, in a way that person who is being disagreeable or belligerent, it takes the control away from them. So, again, going back to the idea of having, a meeting charter or codes of conduct, this really helps to avoid those situations where you sometimes have people who try to hijack meetings by continually speaking out or interrupting. I think that if you can reference a meeting rule that limits that kind of behavior, that solves a problem right from the get-go. So, I think it's valuable to really think about having a meeting charter and following one, especially in cases where you do have meetings that have a lot of contentious issues around the table.
Thank you. I'll come back to the meeting charter in a moment, but we've had a written question, actually a request for suggestions of further reading, if people are interested in doing so. And rather than let you answer that, I'm going to give you a suggestion, Craig, to see if this is okay with you. You've mentioned quite a few authors during on the slides themselves, but also you've mentioned others in your oral presentation. Could you add another slide to the set of recommended readings, and with maybe a tiny bit of annotation, so people who want to read just a little bit or get a more introductory sense would know which to look at, and so forth? Could you do that as part of the presentation that goes onto our website?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I'm glad that there's interest in having those references. I've used them throughout my career. I'm happy to share them, and beyond the books that some of the books authors that I've quoted, there's a lot of research that I've quoted as well. So if anybody is interested in a full list of the references for this webinar presentation, I'm happy to send that as well. But certainly I will add a slide with the covers and the authors of those books that I referenced this afternoon.
Right. I said I was going to get back to meeting charters, and I will, but this suggests another question. How did you get into this topic? Why did you decide to focus so much on these dynamics of discussion and conversation and so on?
Well, I think it goes back to that idea that before we can really talk about ethics and morality, we really have to talk about how we talk, because so much is communicated. The numbers vary, but 80% of our communication is nonverbal. Between 70–80%, depending on what researcher you reference. But and so much is given in those interactions that we often forget that the importance of those interactions and of those those informal or those underlying cues, those body language cues, as it were. And I think that given some of the things that we've been hearing about over the past months, looking at the situation to the south of us, and some of the kind of caustic comments and the way that fake news has entered the vernacular and those kinds of things. We really need to get back to the idea of speaking much more sensitively, much more respectfully, much more civilly. And if we don't have civil environments, if we don't have civil interactions, it's really hard to have ethics and morality.
Personally, I agree with you. One of my favorite authors was Václav Havel, the man who became the first president of Czechoslovakia after the downfall of communism. And in his political writing, he talks a lot about civility as being the utter foundation of a healthy society.
Right. Yeah.
You mentioned the meeting charter before. How often do you see this sort of thing actually being done? It looks like a good idea to me, but I've never noticed anybody actually doing it.
Yeah, there are a number of organizations that use meeting charters. They take different forms, as I noted in that portion of the discussion. Some of them have more of a focus on procedural aspects. Others, are focused more on technical aspects. But certainly we have those kinds of meeting rules in most kind of political deliberations. We have them in boardroom deliberations to an extent. To what extent they're formalized is an open question. I have come across meeting ground rules or a charter in a number of different cases, and in other cases, clearly there have been none. So my effort here in discussing it today is to show that it can really have some value in helping us to set the stage for those civil interactions, to kind of grow civility, to have those kinds of dialogues that you can walk away from and really feel that you've gained some benefit by being involved in them. So yeah, it's an interesting question. How many organizations out there have them? I don't know. I would think that most have them in some form or another, but it would be interesting to look into that further.
Yeah. I think one of the assumptions of our registrants participating in today's webinar was perhaps that the conversations that we want to talk about are those where an ethical issue has been raised within a work group, and the conversation might be taking place between someone who has a kind of an ethics and values role and the person who has been identified or accused of something or other, or perhaps it would be a conversation involving the ethics officer and the two people who are in some kind of disagreement. So that's a kind of a very specific situation. It's not a kind of a team meeting where we need to decide what we want to do for the next half year or something like that. It's kind of a problem solving sort of discussion with confrontation in its more negative senses going on. How do you handle that when there is an assumption going in on the part of one or more people that this is a negative situation where somebody is going to be perhaps blamed and sanctioned if after the investigation there's grounds for that? That's a very negative starting point for a good conversation, I would assume. So how do you factor that in when the situation is one of perceived misbehavior of some sort?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of the response is really covered throughout the webinar. And I think that going back to the example of Brian Muldoon's Code of Confrontation, having respect, showing some courage, that kind of thing. Going back to the example of the, that I gave about the administrative law webinar sessions, where clearly they deal with these kinds of things regularly. And when asked about, how do you deal with those kinds of situations, the response was, comes down to, certainly being transparent in your communications, being very clear from the outset about what this is about, modeling the kind of behavior that's expected, and that should be reciprocated, really embodying those values, those ethical values, so that during that conversation, regardless of how difficult the topic might be, there's still a sense that the person is being listened to, they're being heard, they're being showed, some respect, they're being treated civilly, and that the interaction is one that is not predetermined ahead of time. So I think that signaling those aspects is key. And as I said, one of my colleagues at Osgoode Hall, noted that really setting the tone from the initial meeting, from the initial interaction, is vitally important. So if you can get that right, if you can sound that note, that positive note right from the beginning, then that's going to give shape to the rest of that dialogue, interaction, investigation, what have you.
Good. Thank you for that. I'm scanning here to see if anybody else is either raising their hand or indicating a question. Yes, I do have one coming here.
Hi, Craig. It's Mark Hodson, and I would make a couple of observations, and you can comment on them.
Stop. Craig, can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
So my first one is with respect to the art of listening. Something that I learned was that it's a very useful device when you're trying to listen hard to try to repeat what the other person's position is, what you've heard. It confirms to them that you listened and that you heard and that you got it right. You may decide completely against them, but it's good to let people know that you heard what they had to say. That would be the first little trick that I had, was giving appropriate feedback. The second one was your comment on patience. My personal experience is that in a conversation, I am capable of absorbing the facts that are presented to me. That's immediate. You've given me a new fact that I didn't know. Okay, I've heard it, I can repeat it, I know what it is. But when it comes to more complicated things, for example, opinions on issues and value positions, I am not capable of absorbing that immediately. I've often found in my life that I'll have a conversation, and it's only 3 or 4 months later that I find that my position has changed. And so the requirement for patience requires sort of having 2 conversations, one in which information is exchanged or positions are explained, and the other one where you meet later in order to see how each side has evolved depending on what they heard. So those would be my 2 observations.
Yeah, I agree with, I think those are 2 great observations. I agree that, signaling to the person that you're involved in a dialogue with is that you understand their position, that, you've got it right, so to speak. It goes back to the quote from the IFC talking about, we often assume that, we understand what the conversation, the point of the conversation was, or what the topic is, and oftentimes we can easily get that wrong. So doing that exercise of acknowledging what they're saying and kind of paraphrasing it back is very valuable. And I agree. I've had the exact same experience you have. That it's taken maybe a couple of days or weeks before it really settles in. So having patience, being open-minded, that's essential. It really is, and it's something that is not necessarily natural to everyone, but it's certainly something, a skill that can be honed and refined over time.
Well, thank you, Craig. I would like to encourage all of you who are still on the line to take a minute to use the question area to send in any remarks that you wish to share about the webinar to help us evaluate how this went for you, and also to suggest any further topics that you'd like to have us cover in the future. We plan to continue with our webinars and at the same rate of 4 per year, and we very much appreciate getting any suggestions for speakers or for topics. So please do use either the question box that you have there to share a remark, or alternatively just send a message to our website. Actually, Craig, could you advance to the last slide, which has our website on it? I think you've got 2 more there. There we go. So please just leave that up. And right now I'll say thank you very much to Craig. Goodbye to you for now. And I'll leave the webinar open for a few more minutes in case anybody has some thoughts to share. Thank you all very much for participating. Goodbye for now.
Thanks.